Most of what you do every day, what you think you choose, what you defend, what you desire, you do not for the reasons you tell yourself, but for other reasons. Deeper, more uncomfortable. This audiobook spares no one. We rip off the veil, direct, unfiltered. Your mind is not as honest as you think. You are not as rational as you'd like to be. In your head sits an elephant, huge, heavy, unmoved, and you pretend he isn't there. This is not feel-good therapy, not a motivational seminar. It is a scalpel. Each chapter cuts deeper, to the places that hurt, not to break you, but to awaken you. We are not here to comfort you. We are here to burn down your comfort zone. If you're ready to stay, you will see yourself, without masks, without excuses. Chapter 1. The elephant exists. There are things everyone knows but no one says. Things you sense in the air that show in gestures, in pauses, in the avoidance of a gaze or an overly broad smile. Truths not hidden because they're hard to spot, but because no one has the courage to point them out, even though they stand in the room. An elephant. But here he doesn't sit in the living room, but in your head. And the worst part is, you've learned to ignore him. You notice when you do something that doesn't match what you tell yourself about you, but you immediately invent an explanation. You feel when an impulse guides you that you can't explain, yet you follow it anyway. Sometimes you react in a way that surprises even you, then concoct a plausible justification to fill the gap. You notice, but you don't look, because that would mean questioning yourself. So you build a story, one that sounds good, one that lets you carry on without too many questions. That doesn't make you wrong. It makes you human. Your brain, brilliant as it is not designed to tell you the truth. It's designed to protect you, to keep you stable, to ensure you can live with yourself without falling apart inside. So it conceals, retouches, rearranges. Not with blatant lies, but with stories that feel logical. Those stories give structure to your life, until they don't anymore. Imagine someone watched you for a whole day. They don't speak to you, don't listen, just observe what you do, how you move, what you choose, whom you greet, and whom you avoid, where you look when you think no one's watching. They draw very different conclusions about you than you do yourself. Because you present the edited version, your behavior shows the raw. And that's exactly where the elephant lives. He occupies the space between what you believe you are and what you actually do. That uncomfortable space we fill with pretty explanations, noble motives, neatly pressed stories. Not because we're bad people, but because the truth would be too painful. Because admitting that many of our decisions are driven by fear, by the need for recognition, by vanity, by insecurity, or by power, doesn't fit the image we want of ourselves. We say we help out of compassion, not because we want to be seen. We say we work out of passion, not because we need validation. We say we fight for justice, not because we want to belong. And maybe there's a spark of truth in each, but it's never as pure as we tell. There are layers, and under those layers sits the elephant. We don't see him because we're trained not to. From childhood, we learn to say what adults want to hear. We learn to hide certain feelings, to keep certain thoughts to ourselves. Later, as adults, we do the same, only more elegantly, with fancier words, loftier claims, social tact. But the mechanism is the same. We protect the image we want, of ourselves and in others' eyes. And it's not just about outward image. Sometimes we're our own audience. We must believe we're good, sincere, rational people, else we couldn't sleep. Because if we were truly honest, if we allowed all those contradictions, all those raw, ego-driven impulses, it would be too much. We'd break. So we do something clever. We deny nothing. We simply look away, keep it out of sight, and carry on. With our relationships, our goals, our choices. We believe we're in control. We believe we act consciously. But if we were truly conscious, why do we keep running into the same wall? Why do we say A but do B? Why remain stuck in harmful patterns? The elephant isn't an enemy. He's part of you. The part that acts before you. That's jealous. That wants attention. That avoids conflict. That hides behind a smile even while seething inside. Irrational, raw, unpolished, but real. Recognizing the elephant isn't failure. It's awakening. It hurts. Because once you've seen him, you can't pretend he's not there. You begin to realize many of your decisions sprang not from courage, but from fear. Many of your debates served not truth, but ego. Many of your relationships were not built on love, but on dependency. And yes, it hits hard. It strips away your illusions. But this is where something new begins, something real. When you stop defending your self-image, you become freer. You no longer must constantly justify yourself. You no longer need to appear perfect. You step out of the theater. You see your contradictions and can embrace them. You can say, yes, that's me too. And in that acceptance lies immense power. The elephant doesn't disappear, but he becomes visible. You see how he pushes you, how he guides your choices. And once you see him, you can begin to choose, truly choose. Because only those who see can choose. As long as you ignore him, you are but a spectator in your own show. An actor reciting a script you did not write. This first step, seeing him, changes everything. You can't go back. You have seen him. And now it gets interesting. Chapter 2. The brain doesn't want truth. You might think you seek the truth. That you want to know reality, no matter how uncomfortable. That you're mature, conscious, brave. But that's only partly true. The truth is, your brain doesn't want truth. It wants security, stability. It wants to be right, not to understand. Above all, it wants to shield your self-image from disruption. Truth, the raw, unvarnished truth, is uncomfortable. It scratches. It disrupts sleep. It calls into question what you believed, decided, did. That makes it dangerous. Not because it harms you, but because it forces you to take responsibility. And that is exhausting. It's far easier to deceive yourself than to change. Your brain wields tools to shield you. It builds filters. It ignores discordant information. It remembers selectively. It invents reasons where none existed. It defends beliefs with a fervor untethered from logic. All before you notice, and it feels completely right. Perhaps you felt it. You hear a thought opposing your beliefs, and before you can reflect, you instinctively reject it. Not because it's false, but because it would crack your mental framework. Your instinct whispers, defend your view rather than embrace the unknown. This isn't personal failure. It's a survival mechanism. Our ancestors needed quick judgments, firm convictions, to survive uncertainty. What once protected us now often traps us. A cage of familiar thoughts that convinces us we're free while we run in circles, chasing the same arguments, the same perspectives, the same self-images. We like to believe we crave learning, curiosity, openness. But in truth, we often consume only what confirms us. We follow like-minded people, read agreeable texts, avoid deep debates. And if we venture beyond our comfort, we usually only go as far as our identity allows. Because it comes down to identity. Who are you if your beliefs collapse? What remains when you must admit you were wrong for years? That you weren't as independent, reflective, integrous as you thought? Your brain shields you by weaving stories. Stories where you're the hero, the well-meaning struggler, the righteous one. They're not entirely false. They're incomplete. They omit the uncomfortable, the challenging, the self-redefining. And here lies the real problem. Never challenged. You stay stuck. Same thought patterns, same decisions, same mistakes. And wonder why nothing changes. All because you locked the door to change. Out of fear of truth. Or what it would do to your self-image. Maybe you've lost someone by self-deception. Chosen a job for status, not fulfillment. Stayed in a stifling relationship you called loyalty. These are not anomalies. They're the brain's preference for being right over being honest. And it's brutal to face. It can shake your world. Once you admit self-betrayal, you must face questions you long avoided. Not because you lacked answers, but because you feared their impact. Yet here lies opportunity. Stop fleeing truth, and another life begins. One not puppeteered by your brain, where you observe yourself, question reactions, untangle motives, not to judge, but to understand. Understanding is the first step to freedom. Not comfortable freedom where nothing changes, but real freedom. Uncomfortable, messy, honest. Where you choose because you understand, not to hide from yourself. The brain doesn't seek truth, it seeks peace. But ask yourself, do you want to live as a sedated spectator of your own film? Or are you ready to stand up, step on stage and say, now I see what's happening, and I'm done playing? When you endure truth, however ugly, something stronger than self-deception grows. Clarity. Not about everything, but enough. Enough to spot your self-deceits. Enough to see when your brain wants to protect and you decide to let the truth in. It won't be easy. Truth is seldom kind. It demands. It can hurt, but it's real. And all that truly matters begins there. Not in your story, but in what you dare to feel when the story ends. The moment you stop deflecting truth and look it in the eye, that is when you stop losing yourself. Chapter 3. Morality. More show than conviction. Morality is a big word, a heavy one. It sounds like principles, stance, courage in hard times. But look around, at deeds, not words, and you'll see much of today's morality is theater. Often not even for others, but for ourselves. We post our stances, share our outrage, fast, loud, unequivocal. But what lies behind it? Less than we think. True conviction isn't comfortable. It demands sacrifice, invites conflict with the world and yourself. That doesn't suit a culture where it's easier to hold an opinion than endure it. We decry injustice while quietly benefiting from it. We preach equality until we must give something up. We oppose discrimination until it hits our circle. Not out of malice, but convenience, allowing us moral high ground without moral action. Outrage is easier than true integrity. This isn't new, just professionalized. Once morality showed in deeds, today a post suffices. Once it took courage, today it takes reach. Welcome to the virtue theater. Everyone plays a role, hoping no one looks backstage. But reality lurks beyond the stage. Eventually, you feel the gap between what you show and how you live. You defend principles you ignore. Impose standards you wouldn't meet yourself. Uncomfortable. Not due to exposure, but due to your own dawning awareness that your stance serves ego more than ethics. Morality has become self-marketing, a tool to align with the right side, distance yourself, feel superior. It works, briefly. It feels good. But the longer you play, the emptier it becomes. No solid ground remains beneath all those strong words. Morality becomes applause-seeking, not conviction-driven. Then you face a choice: keep performing or be honest. Honesty isn't perfection. It's acknowledging your inconsistencies, your comfort-seeking, the strategic stances you take. It's stopping self-deception. As long as you believe you're moral merely because you sound moral, you'll never truly be moral. You'll keep fighting good fights while defending your image, not your convictions. True morality doesn't start with loud pronouncements. It starts in quiet acts, doing what gains nothing, sacrificing what you can afford, questioning yourself before judging others. That's hard. It's a lonely path. It earns little applause. You won't be praised for what you didn't post, but what you quietly lived. That's genuine morality, the one you carry when no one's watching, even if it costs you, even if you lose. And here, the circle closes. The elephant in your brain, the blind spot from Chapter 1, whispers that you're on the right side, one of the good ones. As long as you believe it, you'll never question your motives. You'll act out of habit, fear, desire to belong, not conviction. But if you pause and ask not what you stand for, but why, something cracks. The facade or self-image may splinter, but behind it something real may emerge. Not loud but stable, not flawless but authentic. More valuable than any moral pose. In the end, you won't remember your posts, but what you did or didn't do when it mattered. Only you will know. No audience, no applause, just you and your reflection. That's when morality proves itself. When no one's watching and you stand upright anyway. Chapter 4. The value of being seen as a good person. We all want to be good people, or rather, to be seen as good people. That distinction isn't always obvious, but runs deep. Often we care less about who we are inside than what we project. Less about being good than appearing good. The longing to be perceived as good is so ingrained it subtly, constantly guides our choices. From early on, we learn approval is rewarded. A friendly smile, polite behavior, a compassionate glance, all soothe others, reinforce belonging, secure our role. We internalize how to behave for acceptance, when to show empathy, when restraint, when outrage, not out of calculation, but because we're social beings. Belonging means safety. Appearing good means safety. But here's the risk. When appearing good becomes more important than being good, a game ensues that slowly unmoors you from yourself. You soften your words, tread lightly, avoid conflict, not out of peace, but fear of disapproval. You help when it's visible, show compassion when expected, adopt stances when rewarded. Inside, you feel moral. You believe you do right. But your actions lose substance when driven by approval rather than conviction. You function without feeling, give only when uncostly, hide contradictions behind an unblemished image. In our society, goodness is currency. It grants access, trust, respect. But it's only genuine when you act with integrity unseen, when you define yourself by inner alignment, not external reactions. That's hard. It means forgoing applause, approval, the easy route. Often it's easier to feign goodness than face your own shadow. A good mask shields you from criticism, hiding doubts, insecurities, selfishness, without guilt. But that mask is brittle, held up only by constant maintenance. And that costs every day. Some help to be seen. Some forgive as a noble act. Some donate, but loudly. Some champion trending causes. It works, for outsiders briefly, but changes nothing inside. It's strategy, not depth. It's driven by fear of looking small, not by inner conviction. The truth, we all have selfish impulses, contradictions, moments that clash with our moral self-image. Instead of hiding them, we could allow them. Only when you stop merely wanting to look good can you truly be good. And that often looks very different from expectations. It might mean refusing to tell someone what they want to hear. Saying no when yes is easier. Owning mistakes publicly, honestly, without excuses. Stepping away from groups whose values no longer align. Confronting your own limits, your need for approval, your desire to be liked, but staying sincere. Wanting to be seen as good isn't wrong. It's a trap when it prevents honesty with yourself, when it leads you to perform roles instead of owning responsibility, when it stunts growth so you don't shake your self-image. What if you stopped measuring yourself in others' eyes? Measured actions not by reception but by whether you can live with them. What if you forsook perfection for courageous imperfection while staying honest? It would be uncomfortable, quieter. You might lose compliments, maybe contacts, but you'd gain something irreplaceable: credibility with yourself. That's when you don't just appear good, you become good, flaws and all. Not because you always get it right, but because you no longer pretend. When we stop donning perfect masks, something real emerges. When we admit morality isn't a pose, but a constant process demanding courage, honesty, clarity, the shine fades, but depth grows. Perhaps it's not about looking good, but being good when no one expects it, sees it, when it costs you nothing. That's where your true character is forged, not on stage but behind it, in moments without applause when you stand tall anyway. Chapter 5. Opinions, a mask to be liked. We like to believe our opinions stem from thinking, research, experience, an honest, independent inner dialogue, a reflection of personality, values, intelligence. But look closer. Ask not just what you think, but why. And that image crumbles. Opinions often serve as social attire. We wear them to belong, to gain approval, to stand on the right side. They're like costumes that protect us, shape us, make us attractive to others and ourselves. Opinions aren't mere thoughts. They're statements, stances, badges declaring who you are and whom you support. As life shifts into visible social spheres, online, commentable, the effect intensifies. You don't simply speak your mind. You weigh impact. Who might read it, what you gain or lose. Unnoticed, you adjust, perhaps subtly, but you craft your stance on stage, where missteps feel perilous. Many convictions aren't forged by deep reflection but by environment, peer pressure, belonging. You adopt beliefs your bubble endorses, echo others because it feels safe, and eventually assume them as yours, until someone challenges them and you feel unsettled. Not from insult, but from a hidden doubt awakened. You defend, not from conviction, but habit, from knowing the expected tone you must strike. Inside, a gap widens the longer you ignore it. It's not about having no opinions, but about checking if they truly come from you or simply fit the persona you wish to project. Every opinion has a function, defining who you are or aspire to be, determining your circles, invitations, applause, rejections. This mechanism influences not just what you say, but what you dare to think. You might suppress critical thoughts to avoid conflict, dodge dangerous topics, mold your speech to upset no one. In doing so, you lose what should define your thinking: honesty, the courage to be wrong, the willingness to change when needed. Opinions shouldn't be static, but the more you tie them to your identity, the harder it is to change them without self-doubt. Then you defend not ideas but yourself, turning arguments into attacks and inquiries into threats. You fight not because you're right, but because you can't afford to lose to others or yourself. It takes courage to revise an opinion, to say, "I was wrong," or "I'm not so sure anymore." It takes humility to release a long-held thought. and it takes inner calm to endure the fallout. Confusion, unpredictability. Yet there begins real freedom, not from having no opinions, but from being independent of them. The mask of pleasing others is deep and understandable. Everyone craves belonging, understanding, acceptance. But if that comes at the cost of losing yourself, you lose far more than you gain. Your thinking becomes an echo, your voice a reverberation of others. Imagine setting aside all your opinions and asking which still truly resonate. What you'd still say from the heart, unmindful of the audience, and which you carry because they open doors. What remains? What would you say? Perhaps more quietly, but more genuinely. Genuine opinion isn't born from fear of rejection. It arises in stillness, friction, doubt. It doesn't make headlines but shows in small acts. How you speak to those who differ, the patience to listen when it's hard, the choice to pause and understand before responding, and sometimes to say nothing because you're not sure. Perhaps this could be a start. Say less of what sounds good and more of what feels honest. Show less of what you think and question more why you think it, not to unsettle yourself, but to reconnect with the part of you that thinks because it can feel, not because it wants to please. Chapter 6. Education. What we don't want to see. When we talk about education, it usually sounds like upward mobility, like unfolding potential, like the future. We tell ourselves that education is the key to freedom, to justice, to self-realization. Hardly any word carries as much glow, as much societal approval, as much quiet pride. Yet beneath that shine lies something we'd rather not look at, something we prefer to switch off because it doesn't fit the neat story we tell ourselves about learning, knowledge, and progress. For education is not only what it claims to be. It's not automatically an act of curiosity, not always a journey of the mind, not inevitably an expression of inner maturation. Education as we live it often becomes a stage, a currency, an instrument. And the more we ignore this, the deeper we dig ourselves into a system that advertises knowledge, but in truth rewards something very different. It starts early. You learn quickly that school is not about what genuinely interests you, but about what's required. That you're not asked what you really want to understand, but how well you can conform. That the value of your performance is measured not by depth, but by rote. And that the applause goes not to those brave enough to question, but to those who meet expectations. Education thus becomes discipline, and you learn to play along. You notice how points are awarded, how grades work, how to get by without risking too much. You begin learning to pass rather than to grow. You learn to think for exams, to feel for grades, to live for transcripts, and before long you mistake that for real learning. When you move on to university, into your career, into life, you carry that pattern with you. You see education as a means to an end, not because you wish it so, but because that's how the system works. You collect degrees because they open doors. You earn certificates because they sound impressive. You speak of personal development while really focusing on optimizing your resume. And it all feels right, because you gain recognition, you get opportunities, society pats you on the back for it. But eventually comes that quiet moment when you wonder what of all that truly belongs to you. What genuinely sparks your interest? What you have understood not for others, but for yourself. And you realize you may know a lot, but you don't know who you are amid all that knowledge. You can speak, argue, impress, but what's missing is the core, the burning, the real connection to what you've absorbed for years. That's not your fault. It's the way we conceive of education, as a measuring stick, as a status symbol, as proof of discipline rather than depth. We build resumes, not insights. We construct identities from modules, not from inner processes. We gauge ourselves by titles, not by transformations. We ask, "What did you study?" but never, "What changed you?" Yet education was never meant to pigeonhole us. It was meant to break us open, to unsettle us, to teach us to live with uncertainty, complexity, contradictions. But that demands the courage to lose control, and that doesn't jibe with a system grounded in structure, assessment, comparison. We admire people with multiple degrees, with impressive biographies, with academic weight. But we often overlook those who cannot put everything into words because they still feel what they've learned. Those who think slowly, who answer not to shine but to understand, who wear education not as an accolade, but as an inner motion that never stands still. And ourselves. We've learned to define ourselves by our educational paths. Who you are is often tied to what you studied, where you studied, how well you did. But what about what happens between the lines? What can't be examined? What no one taught you, but what emerged within you as you wrestled with yourself? There are many who never boast loudly about their education, yet quietly move worlds within. Who need no diploma to grasp connections? Who don't elevate themselves with knowledge, but deepen themselves through insight? Who read in silence, think in silence, grow in silence. And perhaps that's the part of education we rarely celebrate, because it needs no stage, only honesty. Education is not what you've memorized. It's what remains in you when everything else falls away. It's not the certificate you receive, but the ability to question yourself. And it's not the proof that you've become smarter, but the moment you realize how much you still don't understand. What we don't want to see is the elephant in the room. That education often has nothing to do with depth, but with conformity. That we learn to function, not to question. That in schools and universities we're taught not who we are, but how we should be. And that true education begins where you stop proving what you know and start feeling what you believe. This realization is uncomfortable. It scratches at your self-image, but it's necessary. Only when we see through the game can we begin to play it differently. Not against the system, but for ourselves. Not to please, but to understand. And perhaps then education becomes again what it once was. An inner space where you can meet yourself, beyond expectations, beyond grades. Chapter 7. Work as a stage. We like to speak of work as a vocation, of finding meaning in what we do, of pouring passion into tasks, of self-realization, contribution, leadership, innovation. And of course, there are moments when that's true. Moments when we lose ourselves in a task, when something succeeds that fills us, moves us, propels us forward. But if you look honestly, not just at what's said, but at what simmers beneath, you see something else. Work is often less vocation than performance, less an expression of inner conviction than a carefully composed role. And we perform that role day after day, so convincingly that we eventually forget it's just a play. The moment you step into the office, physical or virtual, you don the mask of productivity, of motivation, of control. You know what to say, how to act, how to come across. The tone in meetings, the way you reach for your mug, the offhand remark about the latest project, all part of choreography learned not out of compulsion, but necessity. For those who don't play along stand out. And standing out is risky, not because of who you are, but because of what you question. Work has long ceased to be only a means to an end. It's become an identity marker, a status symbol, a measuring stick of worth. And the less space we have to find meaning outside of work, the more weight it carries in our lives. People no longer ask, "What do you enjoy doing?" but, "What do you do for a living?" And your answer shapes how you're perceived, competent or mediocre, ambitious or complacent, important or irrelevant. so we build our profiles like stage sets. A resume as script, a LinkedIn profile under the spotlight, a job interview as audition. We know which buzzwords land: teamwork, resilience, leadership, accountability. We repeat them until we believe them. And perhaps we are those things, but not necessarily because we truly are, rather because we've learned how to sound like we are. Meanwhile, the play goes on in everyday work. The unspoken extra hours everyone expects, the 10 p.m. emails as badges of dedication, presentations heavy on polish but light on substance, cordial facades in open-plan offices while exhaustion gnaws within. It's not enough to do good work. You must make it visible. And those who don't pay the price not in performance, but in perception. Yet the longer you stand on that stage, the heavier the role grows. You lose track of where your authentic self ends and your professional persona begins. You become cautious in speech. You filter yourself. You laugh at jokes that don't amuse you, stay silent on topics that stir you, not out of cowardice, but from experience. You learn that in this world you score not with depth, but with conformity. And still we cling to our roles. They give us security, structure, recognition. Because it's easier to put on a good show than to face the chaos that comes when you reveal who you truly are. Perhaps less driven than you pretend. Perhaps more full of doubt. Perhaps someone who would think more slowly if the environment didn't elevate speed as intelligence. There are people who excel in their fields, and yet feel emptier each day. Not because they're bad at it, but because they've perfected the role so thoroughly that they've stopped asking whether their work still resonates with who they are. And they stay. Because it's hard to admit you've invested so much time in a stage you inwardly wish to leave. But what if, for a moment, you stopped performing? If you sat down not as the character you play, but as yourself, without title, without status, only with what truly drives you, or perhaps no longer does? Could you articulate what work does to you, or what it's taken from you? Could you feel what you need beyond targets, appraisals, bonuses? Maybe that's the step many avoid, looking at where the cost has become too high, where the stage turned into a cage, where motivation became a treadmill, presence a pressure, performance proof of one's right to exist. And it's not about quitting everything. It's about waking up within the role you play and checking whether it still fits. Work can be a place of growth, a place where you contribute to something larger than yourself, but only if you stop losing yourself in it. Stop tying your entire self-image to it. Stop believing your worth is measured by what's on your nameplate or how full your calendar is. You may not need to change everything at once. Perhaps it suffices to stop believing everything you've learned about work, that you only count when you're productive, that breaks equal weakness, that conformity is wiser than honesty. Perhaps change begins where you quietly acknowledge you are more than your professional self, and that you have the right to exist beyond the stage, without role, without applause. Chapter 8: Social Networks and the Mental Shop Window. We live in an era where every moment is potential content, every gesture a statement, every image an invitation to be judged. Social networks are no longer mere communication tools. They're mirror mazes, marketplaces, contests, a permanent audience. And though we like to claim we use them for information, exchange, entertainment, we know deep down they've done something to us, something deeper than we care to admit. For once you view life through a lens, your relationship to reality shifts. You don't just think, "What am I doing?" but, "How will it look?" You experience moments not just for yourself. You stage them, you compose them, you direct them. Not always consciously, not always manipulatively, but always with the undertone that what you show should say something about you. Not necessarily what's real, but what's desirable. We post, share, comment, and often believe it's expression of our personality. More often it's expression of our insecurity, our longing for belonging, for relevance, for the sense of being seen. Not as anyone, but as someone who matters, living beautifully, thinking cleverly, feeling compassionately, succeeding, entertaining, mindfully. Someone who embodies all that this digital world values. And knowing this, we curate not only our content, but ourselves. We crop out what doesn't fit. We polish what should shine. We elevate the mundane, stage the accidental, aestheticize everyday life. Eventually, our online selves resemble products more than persons. They're maintained, defended, sold. And the more successful they are, the wider the gap to our interior. This isn't a reproach, it's a mechanism, one rooted deep. Networks reward visibility. The more you appear, the more present you remain. The more engagement you generate, the more you grow. The more you provoke, the more you're amplified. And those who play along feel they belong. You learn quickly what works. You sense when you resonate. And even if you convince yourself you're immune, a part of you still responds because it feels good, because it offers validation, because it's effortless. Yet as your profile thrives, something else can wither. The capacity to leave yourself be, to experience without immediately assigning meaning, to show imperfection, or simply to keep it private. In a world where anything can be visible, privacy becomes the exception. And what you don't share can feel less real, less worthy, less authentic. And that private realm is precisely where you could truly be yourself. No filter, no agenda, no concern for reception. But that demands silence. And silence is hard to endure in a world that's always broadcasting. It feels like vanishing, like regression, like losing relevance. So we stay visible, even as we sometimes vanish inside. There's a special kind of exhaustion unrelated to physical labor, born of constant self-surveillance, the feeling of being always on air, always in comparison, always scrambling to keep up. You scroll, and no matter how good your day was, someone else appears more beautiful, more successful, more composed. And though you know it's theater, only snippets, only part of the story, it still hits you because you compare unconsciously, because you let others' eyes define your worth. And still, we carry on, because it can also be inspiring, connecting, strangely comforting. It's not all false what we see there. It can spark hope, possibility, an echo of who we wish to be. Only, if we're not careful, we mistake the image for substance. We believe we must live, look, feel that way, or something's wrong with us. But perhaps far more of you is fine than you think. Perhaps what you feel in secret is more real than anything you've ever posted. Perhaps the moments you didn't capture shaped you most. And maybe a new chapter begins where you stop displaying yourself and start feeling yourself. That doesn't mean you must go offline. It doesn't mean social networks are inherently wrong. It only means you may ask again why you do what you do. Are you sharing, or merely reassuring yourself you're seen? Are you speaking, or are you afraid of silence? Does what you present truly belong to you, or is it the version of you deem showable? For the greatest luxury today isn't to be seen, but to remain wholly with yourself even when no one is watching. Not to exhibit everything, not to be always available, not to turn every moment into a product, but to know I exist, even without a stage, even without applause, even without likes. And that is enough. Once you sense that, something shifts. The pressure to keep up, the chase for meaning, the endless comparisons. You realize you're more than your profile, that your worth doesn't diminish when you stay silent, that you don't need to prove yourself to exist. You are, without an image, without text, without response. And perhaps there lies the freedom you've sought, not in visibility, but in returning to yourself. Chapter 9. We lie without knowing we lie. Some lies are loud, spoken knowingly, used to protect ourselves, manipulate others, escape an uncomfortable truth. Those lies are obvious. They carry their own guilt. Yet they're not the most dangerous. The most dangerous lie is the one we don't recognize, the one we tell ourselves. Quiet, persistent, insidious. It doesn't wear the face of a lie, but of conviction, of explanation, of a guiding life principle. It lives in our choices, our rationalizations, our justifications. That makes it so hard to expose. We believe we're honest with others, honest with ourselves. But on closer inspection, much of what we hold as truth is in fact construction. We explain our behavior so that it sounds coherent. We embellish our motives. We insert thoughts where there was only impulse. And from all this, we build a self-image that works, not necessarily because it's true, but because it's bearable. A person makes a decision, loses something, gains something else, and says, "I wanted it that way." Maybe that's true. Maybe it isn't. Perhaps it's the best excuse they could muster. Maybe it's easier to claim conscious intent than admit they were driven by fear, or comfort, or the desire to please. Most self-deceptions arise not from calculation, but from necessity. They shield us from inner tensions, from contradictions, from the powerlessness of not being who we wish to be. They hold ourselves together so well that over time we stop noticing them. We repeat the same story until it feels like memory, until we truly believe we lived it. And that's the difficulty. You can't unmask a lie you don't know exists. Sometimes you sense it anyway. A slight tug when you recite your usual lines, an emptiness behind a sentence meant to sound certain, a micro-hesitation before you deliver your version of events. And if you're honest, not out loud but quietly with yourself, you know something's off. That what you say isn't the whole story, perhaps not even the most important part. We lie not only about past events, but about what we feel, what we want, what we need. We claim we're okay, because we must. We say it's fine, because the alternative would be too painful. We insist on independence, while secretly awaiting messages, validation, any sign we're not being overlooked. And we do it without feeling malicious. Often we believe ourselves strong for convincing ourselves nothing's missing. This kind of lie hides behind reason, maturity, clarity. But in truth, it's a shield. Everyone carries one, some large, some fine-grained, some so artful they resemble skin. But sooner or later it becomes tight underneath. It begins to suffocate. Because truth doesn't vanish just because we don't speak it. It lingers. In our bodies, in our dreams, in the way we react before we know why. A person who's deceived themselves long enough eventually loses touch with what's real. They feel something's missing, but can't say what. They grow tired despite doing nothing. Empty despite a life full of engagements. They seek explanations outside, others, past events, without recognizing that what's missing is connection to their own truth. Truth need not be beautiful, strong, wise, or remarkable. But it is real. And it waits, always, patiently. It doesn't force itself. It doesn't shout. It waits until you become silent enough to hear it. And that's when the process begins. Not of insight, but of confrontation. For when you realize you've lied to yourself, clarity doesn't arrive immediately. First comes shame, perhaps anger, perhaps fear of what this admission means about you. But if you stay with it, if you don't look away but face it, something rare happens. You soften. Not into weakness, but into openness. You stop defending yourself. You stop trying to appear perfect. And you begin to listen to yourself, to a degree you may have long forgotten. That's the moment something starts to heal. Not because you can live truth immediately, but because you stop fighting it. because you stop selling yourself a story. And because you start taking yourself seriously again. Even with your imperfections, your contradictions, the chaos left when the lies grow quiet. We all lie. Not out of malice, but because we're human. And because sometimes it's easier to deceive ourselves than to shatter our reflection. But the moment you allow the cracks is the moment you come back to yourself. Perhaps it's not about becoming perfect, but about being honest enough that you no longer need to hide what's imperfect. Chapter 10. What we don't say speaks. There are conversations that never happen. Questions hanging in the air, unasked. Truths standing between people, unspoken. It's a mistake to think silence means nothing. That what isn't said has no effect. On the contrary, the very things we skirt around, swallow, hint at, or deliberately skip, those often speak loudest. Not in words, but in glances, in distance, in a tone that's too friendly, a smile that lingers a half-second too long, a sudden change of subject, an unspoken retreat. We think we protect ourselves, others, the moment. We say nothing because we believe words could destroy what still stands. We hope maybe it will resolve itself, dissipate, fade away. But the truth is, what's not said doesn't go away. It remains, it sinks in, it alters the relationship, and it changes us. An unspoken feeling isn't merely silent. It grows, warped and urgent within. It colors everything that follows. Unspoken words don't stay neutral. They become a burden, a barrier, a shadow. They turn closeness into cautious maneuvering, honesty into a dance of half-truths. And eventually you realize you still meet one another, but no longer truly connect. It takes courage to speak what might threaten harmony. But sometimes it takes even more courage to endure the silence that follows when you don't. For every omission has a cost, paid in tension, in uncertainty, in the sense you're never fully present. And often that cost accumulates until you can't remember when the silence began, only that it now permeates everything. And it's not just about grand confessions or painful truths. Sometimes it's the small things that go unsaid. A simple, "That hurt me." A quiet, "I needed you." "I don't know what I feel." Such sentences don't solve everything, but they open a space. They show someone is there, willing to appear, not perfect, but present. The problem is we've learned to do the opposite. Appear strong, composed, in control. Not needy, not complicated. We talk about projects, plans, opinions, but when it gets personal, we withdraw. Not always out of fear of the other, often out of fear of ourselves. Because we know that what we ought to say would make us vulnerable. Yes, words can wound, but silence wounds more quietly, and for longer. It seeps into the spaces between, into what's no longer asked, into what we no longer offer. Until eventually we may not even miss the lost chance, because we've forgotten how it felt to be heard. Many conflicts don't spring from what was said, but from what was never named, buried in moments when we chose to swallow rather than speak. With each of those choices, something shifts, not immediately visible, but palpable. You still laugh together, but depth is gone. You still plan together, but with an inner distance. And nobody recalls exactly when it began, only that it's there. The same holds true within ourselves. We speak of self-reflection, honesty, inner growth, yet routinely ignore our own signals. We distract ourselves, downplay, avoid. We tell ourselves we're content, though we're restless. We explain away what troubles us, pretending it wasn't important. We look away from the part of us crying, "It can't go on like this." And the longer we do, the quieter that voice grows, and the louder the unease. Not everything must be said. Some thoughts are best left unspoken, Some silences hold more respect than any word. But when silence becomes habit, strategy, constant excuse, you lose not only contact with others, but with yourself. True connection begins when you voice what has been hard to say. When someone says, "I didn't understand you," or "I was afraid," or even, "I don't know if I can forgive you." Not because such words fix everything, but because they show someone willing to appear in uncertainty, imperfection, pain. What we don't say is never neutral. It builds walls, even when meant to protect. And if we don't eventually tear those walls down, we remain trapped within assumptions, misunderstandings, a togetherness that is merely facade. In the end, it's not about saying everything perfectly or erupting emotionally. It's about deciding not to stay silent, having the courage to voice something unfinished, something not polished, not certain, not planned, but real. Because words withheld are never neutral. They construct barriers. And sometimes a single sentence is enough to interrupt the pattern. A sentence needn't be clever, complete, or rehearsed. Only honest, only alive, only there. Chapter 11. Generosity has its codes. When we talk about generosity, it always sounds like something good. Empathy, humanity, selfless giving. We associate it with warmth, decency, a certain moral glow. But the closer you look, the more complex the picture becomes. Few virtues are as publicly rewarded, as socially charged, and yet as quietly conditioned as generosity. It's celebrated, expected, quietly judged, and often unconsciously bound to motives no one talks about. Yes, we give. But how often do we give because we truly want to, and how often because it suits our role? How often is our generosity an act of connection, and how often a silent investment in our self-image? People don't like to discuss that, for fear of devaluing the gesture. Yet questioning the gesture does not devalue it. It simply makes it clearer, more honest, and perhaps a bit more human. It starts early, almost imperceptibly. You bring the teacher a small gift. You thank acquaintances with exaggerated gestures. You pass something along and immediately feel that lands well. Generosity echoes. Rarely does it remain hidden. Even if we claim to expect nothing in return, there's a part of us that hopes to be seen. Not loudly, not overtly, but palpably. It's not about thunderous applause. Sometimes a quiet nod, a warm glance. The knowledge that you'll be remembered as a good person is enough. That echo becomes a system. We learn that giving changes not only a situation, but also ourselves. Generosity confers power, not in an obvious way, but as a subtle lever in social dynamics. The giver stands above the receiver. The helper occupies a position of strength, and thus codes emerge, unspoken rules about how, when, and to whom one may give without losing balance. For there are conditions. We prefer to give when gratitude is assured, when the recipient will appreciate it appropriately, when a respectful distance can be maintained, and when the power dynamic remains clear. It becomes more difficult when giving would require us to be vulnerable, when it exposes us, binds us to something we may not want to feel. Then generosity feels brittle. Consider someone who donates to an organization, magnanimously, publicly, with the best intentions, while ignoring the quiet needs of those closest to them. Not because they're heartless, but because that proximity is uncomfortable. It raises questions and doesn't fit the image they've painted of themselves. Generosity at arm's length is easier. It's controllable, measurable, narratable. This shows how much our notion of generosity is coded. Givers often use generosity to position themselves, conscious, moral, aligned with a vision of justice. But at times it's less justice that drives us than the desire to appear right. Before others, yes, but also before ourselves. Nothing polishes our conscience better than a timely good deed in the right light. This is not to say giving is wrong, it merely means we ought to be honest about our motivations. Generosity is seldom pure, and it need not be to be valuable. It may be ambivalent, contradictory, even a touch selfish, so long as we're aware of it, and not pretending every act is an unalloyed expression of selflessness. True generosity demands more than an image. It demands willingness, not just to give, but to be touched. It brings us face to face with what we otherwise avoid: powerlessness, dependency, the admission that someday we too must receive from another. That is hard, because giving is easily mistaken for control, and receiving for weakness. One who truly wishes to be generous must be willing to leave the game of power and recognition behind. To give without knowing how it will land. To let go of always being right, always standing in the light. That is why true generosity is so rare, not because opportunities are lacking, but because depth is. Sometimes generosity appears in different forms, not in money, nor in grand gestures, but in the space we offer, listening without advice, simply being there without expectation, bearing a moment that has no utility, no punchline, no shareable story. Generosity that doesn't sparkle, but endures, that doesn't instruct, but accompanies, that doesn't judge, but truly sees. Perhaps it's not about giving as much as possible, but about asking yourself honestly what giving does to you. Does it connect or separate you? Does it elevate or touch you? Does it bolster your role or confront you with your own humanity? For that is where the difference lies between a gesture and an attitude. And once you've experienced what it means to be genuinely moved by what you give without losing yourself, then you no longer need an audience. The gesture loses its function as proof and becomes something you do simply because you must, because it feels right. Not because you should, but because you want to. Not always, but often enough. And perhaps that is the most honest form of generosity. Imperfect, impure, tinged with vanity, yet conscious and close. Chapter 12. Sex, Desire, and Appearance, the Invisible Game. There are topics we talk about without really saying anything. Sex is one of them, and so is desire. And especially the daily performance we carry out through our bodies, clothing, and presence. We've learned to speak on these subjects as if they were open, liberated, detabooed. But much of what passes for openness is actually a new rule book. Beneath the surface lies something deeper than any debate about preferences, body image, or gender roles. Power, insecurity, the need to be seen, not just as a person, but as an object of desire, and the fear of precisely that. We live in a society where attractiveness is not merely an attribute, it's currency. It governs attention, inclusion, opportunities. And though few admit it aloud, everyone senses how strongly this silent order shapes behavior. How we present ourselves, how we move, what we disclose and what we accentuate. All is rarely accidental. It's part of a game hardly anyone consciously opts into, yet almost everyone eventually plays. One can reject the game, try to ignore it, stand above it, but even that very rejection is a reaction to its existence. Even those who opt out often define themselves by the same mechanism, only in opposition. That reveals how deeply rooted it is, how our self-image is bound up in how desirable we appear, not only to others, but to ourselves. For desire isn't only external, it's an inner gauge, a mirror in which we learn to find ourselves attractive in order to feel worthy at all. As absurd as it sounds, many people can only like themselves once they feel desired by others, not from vanity, but because we've been taught. Visibility equals worth, and erotic visibility even more so. So we adapt. We train, style, stage ourselves. We take selfies from flattering angles. We post images neither too risque nor too tame. We send signals subtle enough to avoid rebuke, clear enough to make an impact. With every like, every glance, every reaction, a quiet affirmation forms. You matter. You are seen. And that feels so good. Perhaps too good not to chase. Yet in this game, it's easy to lose track of where your own desire ends and others begins. We believe we want what we've learned to embody, that our lust is free, our tastes individual, but often they're echoes of a collective ideal. What we take as my preference may simply be the residue of reflected expectations, and what we desire at times is merely what we think we ought to desire. This dynamic shows especially among men, who feel pressured always to be ready, dominant, in control, and among women who navigate a tension between closeness and autonomy, self-determination and projection. The codes differ, but the game is the same. Who are you when you're not desirable? And what remains of your self-worth when no one notices you? In this equation, sex becomes confirmation rather than intimacy, less about connection than impact. Those who have sex win. Those desired have agency. Those visible hold options. Those who cannot keep up lose, not necessarily in the spotlight, but in their own insecurity, in the lingering fear of being overlooked. It's not that they don't want to play, it's that they can't. And yet, despite all these mechanisms, there are genuine moments, touches that seek no proof, desire that plays no roles, a gaze that doesn't scan, but truly sees. Such moments arise only when the game is set aside, if only briefly. When two people needn't perform, but simply be, not as characters, not as images, but as bodies, feelings, living presence. That may sound simple, but it is not. To meet this way, one must be willing to step aside from codes, expectations, constant comparison, dare not to play, or to play only when it genuinely fits, and ask oneself, what moves me? Not what works, not what gets noticed, but what feels authentic when no one else is watching. Perhaps here begins a different view of sex, desire, and appearance, neither naive nor idealistic, but awake. One that acknowledges the pull of visibility, yet refuses to mistake it for genuine contact. One that permits beauty, sensuality, attraction, not to be pleasing, but as expressions of self-awareness, and knows true worth never depends on being desired. In a world where everything can be seen, it is radical to not require constant display. In a society where desire is capital, it takes courage to stand tall even when you feel invisible. And in a system that compares, judges, optimizes bodies, it demands depth not to forget that true connection is possible only where nothing needs proving. Sex, desire, and appearance form an unclean field, a tangle of fears, hopes, habits, power. But the more honestly we play, the more consciously we unmask our own codes, the more we can again feel what truly matters. Closeness, touch, recognition, not as an ideal, not as an image, but as a human being, in all the messy reality that entails. Chapter 13. Fear as a hidden driver. Fear is not a topic we like to discuss, especially not in a culture that demands strength, achievement, control. We've trained ourselves to appear composed, resolute, focused. We speak of goals, values, motivation, but seldom of what lies beneath. That which drives us when no one's watching. The fear that doesn't shout but presses quietly, that doesn't block but steers, that doesn't break but propels, and precisely for that reason often goes unnoticed, though it underlies so much. Many decisions we label rational sound, logical, admirable, even courageous. But if you trace the thread backward, you often find not conviction, but insecurity, fear of loss, a deep longing to safeguard yourself against failure, rejection, oblivion. We build careers and choose relationships not only from desire, but from dread. We structure our lives around what we fear, not merely around what we want. We pick stable professions, not for passion but for security. We stay in hollowed-out relationships, not for love but because the emptiness afterward seems worse. We stay silent where we should speak up, conform where we should stand out, not from principle, but because confrontation feels too costly. Fear hides behind the language of responsibility. Fear is not weakness, it is part of being human. It becomes dangerous only when unrecognized, when we believe we act freely, though we merely react, when we think we're unfolding, yet in truth merely avoiding. Then we build our lives around something unnamed, circling an inner core of insecurity and calling it prudence, maturity, or wisdom. And fear often masquerades as ambition, the suit of control, perfectionism, endless optimization, the voice saying, "Not quite good enough." The gaze on others that doesn't admire but compare, the impulse to keep everything in hand even at the expense of vitality. Some function, achieve, shine their whole lives, yet never find rest, not because they want too much, but because they never quiet themselves enough to feel what they actually flee from. And the more praise they gather, the harder it is to admit they act under duress. That what looks like strength is really fear dressing up as performance. But fear can fuel high achievement, sometimes to remarkable feats. That's its treachery. As long as it produces results, no one questions it. Not the world, not ourselves. Only when joy vanishes, when tension becomes baseline, do we pause. The greatest power of fear is disguising itself as necessity, duty, reality. That's how the world is, we say. You must perform. I have no choice. And that holds true only if we never permit ourselves to look honestly within, to ask who speaks when we decide, the brave part of us, or the part that simply does not want to risk. There is no single cure for fear, not victory over it, not elimination. Fear remains. It belongs to life. But what can change is our relationship with it. Whether we unconsciously yield or deliberately include it, whether it rules us or we listen to it without surrendering. Fear has something to tell us, where we care most, where we're vulnerable, where we dread losing what we once lacked. When you begin to approach your fear with curiosity rather than judgment, it softens, becomes tangible, and you realize it often predates the current trigger. It carries a story, childhood wounds, betrayals, moments when you stood alone, overwhelmed, inadequate. And therein lies opportunity. Recognizing that your present choices replay old patterns lets you choose anew, not impulsively nor in spite, but mindfully. You can face situations not to vanquish them, but to refuse hiding. That shift transforms more than any tactic. It's not about eradicating fear, but refusing to let it decide everything. As long as it remains unconscious, it dictates paths, people, possibilities without your knowledge. Sometimes a single honest admission, aloud or in private, sparks change. I'm doing this because I fear being irrelevant, or I stay because I fear I can't start over. Once that sentence is spoken, a shift begins. Maybe imperceptibly, maybe not immediately, but inwardly the perspective realigns. You are no longer fear's victim, but its witness. And from that stance emerges freedom. Not perfect, not easy, but built on truth, and therefore enduring. Chapter 14. The self-image is a product. Every person carries an image of themselves, not visibly like an ID card, but felt in every step, every conversation, every choice. It's the story we tell about ourselves, the version we believe when no one is listening. The explanation of who we are, what defines us, how we became who we are. And though we treat that self-image as our innermost core, it is often a construct, a product woven from expectations, reactions, reflections, shaped by others, adopted by us, refined over years, defended as if it were ours, though perhaps it never truly was. No one begins life with a finished self-image. It grows gradually. In parents' eyes, teachers' words, silent comparisons with siblings, friends, idols, from what we're encouraged to be and what we're denied, from praise that sticks and criticism that cuts deeper than we admit. Eventually, we behave like someone created by that narrative, not because it fits, but because it's safe, because it brings recognition, because it offers structure in a world that feels vast, demanding, bewildering. We think we know ourselves, but often we know only the version that works, the one that earns approval, meets expectations, doesn't ask too much of others. Thus, the self-image becomes a filter. We not only say, "This is who I am," but also, "This is who I'm allowed to be." What doesn't fit is sorted out, repressed, reinterpreted. We learn to tell ourselves a compelling story, coherent, familiar, clearly messaged. Yet what we omit is not secondary, it is substance. For in all we exclude from our self-image lie the parts that move us most, our contradictions, fractures, untamed, unfinished impulses. The pieces that don't fit, that don't sound pretty, that don't glitter, but precisely for that reason live, breathe, and feel human. Yet rather than acknowledge these parts, we push them aside, fearful of losing the image we've so painstakingly built. We've invested too long into becoming that figure to discover who we might be without it. So we live in a construct, not invented, but selective, not false, but incomplete. And the longer we remain within it, the more we come to believe it. That's just who I am. Or, that's always been my way. Perhaps, but perhaps it's also the comfort zone of a narrative we learn to cherish. A habit, not a truth. The self-image becomes a brand, a fixed identity we carry like a business card. Succinct, memorable, serviceable, but also constricting. For what happens when you feel differently than your brand allows, when you notice growth your image can't incorporate? Then the image cages you. You must conform to yourself. And that is one of the greatest paradoxes. You find yourself pretending, not for others, but to your own narrative. You minimize yourself despite inner growth, or you inflate yourself when you're weary. You keep playing the role you wrote for yourself because you don't know who you'd be without it. But therein lies possibility. When you recognize your self-image is not you, but only describes you. It need not confine you. You can reshape it without losing yourself, for you're not the sum of the labels attached, but the awareness that observes them. You can see how you cling to old tags, define yourself by outdated stories, and so lose touch with feeling. Because the self-image carries a price. It shields from uncertainty, yet separates from spontaneity. It offers stability, yet robs depth. It tells you who you are, yet not who you could become. The more you cling to it, the less freedom you leave for change. You become a version of yourself that fulfills expectations, even your own, but not your innermost truth. Perhaps this is the moment to step back, not to demolish what you believe about yourself, but to examine it with calm honesty and the willingness to be surprised. For there are facets of you you've long ignored, not absent, but never asked to fit the old story. Yet they needn't fit. They need only to be acknowledged. A new self-image doesn't spring from radical rupture, but from permission, from the courage to refuse reduction, to hold contradictions without immediate resolution, and from trust that you exceed any label, even your own. Your self-image is a product built from many fragments. But you are no product. You are process, movement, depth, an open system. And that is what makes you alive. Chapter 15. The pain of self-deception. There come moments when the story you've been telling yourself no longer holds. You stand on seemingly solid ground, and it crumbles beneath your feet. Not because someone else has exposed you, but because something inside you refuses to play along. A part of you that's long been silent begins to press, not loudly or aggressively, but unmistakably. And the harder you cling to the old narrative, the greater the inner pressure grows. For the pain of self-deception is quiet. It works in the background, consuming you without demanding attention. Self-deception is a survival mechanism. It doesn't arise from malice, but from protection. You tell yourself everything's fine, even when you feel the void. You rationalize choices that no longer serve you, because the alternative is too shattering. You act as if in control, while inside you hover at the limit. And the paradox is, you believe your own deception, not out of naivete, but because for a time it's easier to lie to yourself than to break apart. But self-deception only works when you don't turn inward for long. So long as you remain busy, distracted, productive, functional, you can ignore the niggling doubts. Yet eventually the space tightens until a single conversation, a single phrase, a glance cracks the facade. In that moment, you no longer trust the old story. And that's when the pain begins. It is painful to admit you've not been honest with yourself, not merely toward others. It scratches your self-image, rattles your sense of who you were, what you wanted, whom you claimed to be. For acknowledging years of self-deception means more than acknowledging mistakes. It means admitting you never fully knew yourself, that you settled for a comforting story rather than a truthful one, and accepting that requires courage, not shame or self-loathing, but compassion for the version of you that did its best. Yet that version once sustained you. The pain doesn't just come from uncovering deception, but from realizing you needed it. That at the time you lacked the strength to face truth, that you wore a role to avoid shattering. Accepting this demands compassion for your past self, not condemnation. Now you're at a different crossroads. The old protection no longer suffices. The story no longer supports you. And you're left with the emptiness in between. A phase in which you barely recognize your own words because they've grown hollow. You find yourself uttering phrases you no longer feel, syncing words to a picture that no longer matches. You can mask it for a while, through discipline, routines, distractions. But the inner tension intensifies because you know you cannot live forever against yourself. Burnout isn't from your tasks, but from sustaining a self that's outgrown its story. Some spend years ignoring that pain. Others sense it early but lack the language to describe it. Inevitably, it emerges. In restlessness, bodily tension, a nameless ache. And reaching that point isn't failure, it's a breakthrough, albeit a messy one. For only by allowing that pain does something open. Not instantly nor neatly, but gradually and in fragments. You begin to ask what you really want. Not what's sensible, not what's expected, not what you once vowed. You grow quieter in the wrong company, sharper in noticing what you long ignored, and realize you cannot return to who you were without losing yourself anew. The path out of self-deception isn't linear. It's chaotic, uncertain. You may cry over unnameable losses or rage at your own blindness. But that's part of the process, the price of returning to yourself. Once you start paying it, the burden lightens, not by becoming painless, but by becoming truer. Behind the pain lies something previously inaccessible, a new clarity, a tenderness, authenticity. And you learn that self-deception wasn't betrayal, but protection. You were neither foolish nor naive, but human, and that humanity equips you now to forge a new way. You will speak differently, less to justify, more to listen. You'll handle yourself with care, not anxious but respectful. because you know what it costs to lose yourself. You'll no longer follow paths where you no longer belong, not out of stubbornness, but because you've learned that true authenticity begins softly, yet transforms everything. The pain of self-deception is not the end. It's the moment something real begins. Though you may not yet grasp it, though you may falter and doubt, stay with it. Not because it becomes easy, but because you deserve to stop living against yourself and start living with yourself, without roles, masks, or stories that shield rather than show who you are when you have nothing left to prove, not to anyone, including yourself. Chapter 16. The Elephant in Others. It's easy to turn your gaze inward and grapple with your own chaos. Harder, yet at least controllable. You decide how deep to dig, what to allow, what to conceal. But the moment you relate to others, everything becomes more complicated. For you encounter not only them, but also their blind spots, their fears, their lies, their unspoken truths, the elephants they've carefully stowed in the dark corners of their consciousness, yet whose presence fills the room. Sometimes you spot it immediately, the laugh that sounds hollow, the powerful argument that feels like a barricade rather than expression. It could be a friend, a colleague, a partner, a parent, someone you love or respect, someone who challenges or supports you. And eventually you realize you've been talking to a version of them, not to them themselves. The elephant stands between you, and no one names it. Sometimes you want to call it out. You want to say, "I see you, and I see what you're not saying." But you hold back, for you've learned not everyone is ready to be seen. You know how dangerous it can be to touch another's facade, sometimes to protect them, sometimes yourself. Because the truth is, naming the elephant cracks everything open, and you never know what will spill out. Most people live in a delicate balance between self-narrative and avoidance. They know something's off inside them, but have found ways to function. They keep working, laughing, loving, all from behind a small inner distance. And if you as an outsider disturb that balance, you may not be seen as a helper but as a threat. You hold up a mirror they didn't ask for, and often they become angry, not because you're wrong, but because you're right. It takes tact to know when you truly want to help, and when you just want to be right. For it's tempting to name the elephant to feel superior, to believe you're more awake, reflective, clear. But true seeing isn't superiority. It's compassion. It's perceiving another without exposing them, feeling them without correcting them, holding space for them, even though you know they're hiding there. And then there's another dimension, when you see their elephant because it mirrors your own, when their avoidance triggers you, reminding you of what you've long ignored. Then it becomes personal and painful. For what seems like clarity is often projection. You see yourself in the other and try to fix, heal, or change them because you couldn't do it for yourself. This shows especially in relationships. We often fall in love not just with a person, but with their drama, their pain, their contradictions, what remains unresolved. And before long, you're fighting for truth as much as for closeness, trying to awaken, rescue, or convince them, though they may not want to wake up. Not yet. Because they still need their elephant. Because the pain behind their facade is deeper than you imagine. Then you must decide, will you stay? And if so, how? Can you love without rescuing? Be present without playing therapist? See without demanding? Not everyone is ready to change just because you are. Not everyone wants to look simply because you do. And accepting that, without cynicism, without shutting down, is one of the greatest challenges in any deep connection. There are times when you must distance yourself, not out of coldness, but self-protection. Because the other's elephant presses too close. Their silence makes you ill. You lose yourself trying to rescue them. This isn't failure, it's a boundary. And sometimes that boundary is necessary for any healing to happen, on both sides. But there are also other moments, the precious, quiet, genuine ones, when for a moment the other sets their elephant aside, when they show you more than they allow themselves, when a look, a word, a tremble in their voice says, "I know you see me," and you sense, now something opens. Not because you pushed, but because you stayed, because you didn't judge, because you held the space without filling it. Those moments are rare. They can't be forced, yet they change everything. They show that we can truly see one another without losing ourselves. That closeness arises not when everything is spoken, but when something can remain unspoken without being denied. The elephant in others will remain. You can't always chase it away. You may even feed it unwittingly, but you can learn to recognize it without letting it rule you. You can choose when to name it and when to stay silent. And you can learn that true seeing isn't about uncovering everything, but about holding what has become visible, without fear, without pressure, and with profound respect for the other's complexity. For in the end, none of us are only our clarity. We are also our avoidance. We are not only what we understand, but also what we dare not feel. And perhaps real connection begins there, where we stop trying to fix one another and start carrying each other with the elephant, not against it. Chapter 17. Not everyone wants to wake up. There comes a phase on your path when you become almost obsessed with understanding things. You dig, you question, you spot patterns, you shatter old stories, and experience liberation and collapse at once. Everything that once seemed normal suddenly feels questionable. Relationships shift, priorities change, truths crack open. And from this intense process arises a need. The need to sweep others up in your discovery, to make them see what you see, to make them feel what you felt, because you believe, and often sincerely feel, that it could help them, that it would be good for them to face themselves so honestly. Then you confront a bitter truth. Not everyone wants that. Not everyone craves depth. Not everyone wants to know what lives within them. Not everyone is willing to question what anchors them, even when that anchor rests on lies. And the more you try to pull someone in that direction, the stronger the resistance. For there is an inviolable boundary within each person, the choice of when and whether to face themselves. You can offer understanding, clarity, presence, but you can't force anyone to see themselves. And if you try, however well-intentioned, you eventually cease to be support and become disturbance, an assault on whatever they've struggled to hold together internally. What you meant as an invitation lands as intrusion. It's not easy to accept, especially when it concerns someone you care about. You see them spinning in circles, stuck in old patterns and stories that shrink them. You sense the potential within them if only they'd take a small step, open up, be more honest with themselves. And yet, they remain. Or they do the opposite. Shut down, harden, defend themselves against something you never meant as attack. But there lies a crucial point. Awakening isn't a collective process. It's a profoundly personal, intimate choice. And for many, the very idea of questioning everything they believe about themselves feels threatening, not freeing. For what remains if their familiar stories crumble? What holds them up if their identity roles no longer fit? That answer is unbearable for some. Some need the illusion to keep going. The belief that it all makes sense, that they're right, that the problem is always elsewhere. And that may be sad, but it's human. Not everyone has the inner resources, the history, the resilience. Not everyone wants to awaken, because sleep feels safer, and they've learned awakening delivers not just light, but pain. The mistake is believing awakening is always better, that insight automatically brings happiness. The journey of self-discovery is not comfortable. It's raw, demanding, chaotic. And not everyone wants to go through it, at least not now. Maybe later, maybe never. And that too is part of true maturity. Recognizing you cannot force your path on another, not out of love, not out of fear, not even out of compassion. You can be present. You can embody honesty, openness, wakefulness. You can model what integrity, clarity, responsibility look like. And sometimes that alone suffices. Not the words, not the debates, but the presence of someone who no longer deceives themselves. Yet it works only when it's not wielded as pressure. When you allow the other to remain where they are. There will come people you must eventually go silent with. Not because you run out of words, but because you understand everything has been said. And because you feel that more push only drives them away. And perhaps that is the hardest. Enduring someone staying where they are while you move on, without giving up on them, but also without betraying yourself. For if you continually dim your light so you don't overwhelm them, if you suppress your clarity to spare their comfort, you remain trapped in their dream too. And eventually the cost is too steep. You lose yourself to save someone who doesn't want saving. True connection happens where each stays responsible for themselves, where you see the other in all their depth and also in their limits, where you can love without missionizing, be close without self-sacrifice, remain clear even as they turn away. Perhaps one morning you'll wake and notice, I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago. And some around me aren't either. But others are, and want it that way. Then it's not about persuading them, but about deciding how much closeness can remain under these conditions. How much genuine connection endures when one wants to see, and the other does not. Not everyone wants to wake up, and you needn't force them. You only need to choose how awake you're willing to be, and what you're prepared to lose for it. For the price of clarity can be steep, but the price of denying yourself is steeper. Eventually you must choose approval or truthfulness, closeness at any cost or honesty that may leave you more alone. There is no coldness in that choice, only dignity for yourself and for the other. For no one awakens because they're forced, but because they feel permitted, when they're ready. Until then, keep walking, clear, quiet, awake, certain you're not alone. Only no longer at home, everywhere. Chapter 18. Radical honesty isn't for everyone. Radical honesty bears no sign reading caution, revelation, appearing at first like liberation. It promises clarity, intimacy, authenticity, as if every unspoken word were a shackle we can shed. But it's an attitude demanding more than courage. It requires inner stability, self-acceptance, genuine compassion. Without these, it becomes a weapon, against others or against ourselves. That is its danger. Not everyone is ready to pay its price. Not everyone wears sunglasses on the sunlit path of merciless truth. Radical honesty begins with peering into your innermost self. You unearth thoughts and feelings you prefer to ignore. You name shortcomings, fears, contradictions, and you name them aloud, if not always to others, then at least to yourself. Yet this interplay of self-discovery and expression calls for something rarely included. Patience, with yourself, with the other, with the silence that follows brutal truths. When you practice radical honesty, you often meet defense. No one wants to be confronted with what they long avoided. And when you do, it doesn't feel poetic. It feels like attack, even when you intend love. Radical honesty is seldom comfortable. It asks questions before one is ready to hear. It opens spaces you believed sealed. It shines a light into corners you've managed to keep dark, and sometimes evokes exhaustion rather than relief. Those who live in radical honesty must recognize two things. First, it's a path, not a destination. Not a state you arrive at, but a process you inhabit. And second, it cannot be one-sided. You cannot practice it alone and expect genuine closeness. It requires a partner willing to walk alongside you, perhaps not on the exact same route, but at least in the same realm. Otherwise, you stand alone, exposed, visible, unprotected. That is why radical honesty fails in many relationships. Because the other doesn't bear the same burden. Because they take critical words as critique. Because they withdraw when truth has no container. Then you're left with emptiness. Not the honest kind, but the distancing kind. And clarity quickly becomes loneliness. One cannot deny, honesty is uncomfortable. It can wound, not just others, but yourself, when you feel the weight of your unveiled truths. You might lose relationships. You might see illusions you once cherished dissolve. You might realize people you rarely criticized have long exhausted you. And in all this, you stand between liberation and loss. Radical honesty needs more than words. It needs emotional space, distance, inner resilience. It needs the capacity to breathe, even without approval, and a vision for why it works. Not because everything becomes easier, but because everything becomes clearer. Clear in its pain, but also in its depth. For seeing truth is not gentle, it is profound, sometimes ruthless. Yet there are ways to enter this territory. Cautiously, mindfully, resolutely. One step is to speak partial truths deliberately. Share not every detail, but what matters. Reveal not the full story, but what's necessary. Show the other you won't flee their reaction, but invite them not to flee your truth. Practice a language that is clear without cutting off. Create space for dialogue, not monologue. And notice how much easier honesty becomes when you trust yourself, when what you say no longer pricks inside. When you know, I will not lose by revealing myself. I only lose if I hide. This isn't a mantra, but a proving ground. For yourself, for the other, for the truth. Radical honesty is an exercise in responsibility for what you say, because it arises not to produce effect, and for what you hear without needing immediate reaction. It's an invitation to reflection, not revolution, for yourself and with the other. It can heal, connect, free, but only if you know what you're doing, if you weigh when it's courage, when it's overwhelm, when it's necessary. For only truth held can give feathers, to the speaker and to the listener. Not everyone wants this journey. Some prefer to keep sleeping because it's warmer. Some fear the void truth brings. And others simply aren't ready for a mirror called honesty. But even if you're the only one holding that mirror, it can have effect. Not for all, but for you. And that is enough. You needn't bring everyone along. You need only follow yourself. You need not speak loudly, but remain softly clear. You need not script perfect words, but speak authentically. You need not secure everyone, but stand firmly in your truth, chewing on your process, despite pain, doubt, or solitude. For radical honesty isn't a badge. It is the expression of who you are, a person willing to see and to be seen. Because in that seeing lies more than words. And those who carry it need no stage, only courage. And that is enough. Chapter 19. Seeing the elephant changes everything. You can invest years in yourself, read wise books, attend seminars, immerse in psychology, spirituality, philosophy, and still circle around the pivotal point. You can reflect, analyze, question yourself, strive for transformation, and yet stall at a certain threshold. This isn't about intellectual grasp, willpower, or discipline. It goes deeper and becomes apparent only when you're ready to truly look. Not at who you wish to be, not at what you show, but at what you've long brushed aside, the elephant within you, The moment you see it isn't a dramatic awakening with spotlight and fanfare. It's often quiet, terrifyingly quiet, and yet so clear you cannot return. You realize what you've suppressed, bypassed, sugarcoated was never gone. It was there all along, steering your choices, coloring your relationships, shading your words, feeding your fears. You lived as though it weren't there, but it was, and now you cannot overlook it. That realization changes everything, not because the world rearranges, but because for the first time you understand how you've distorted it through your own lens. The elephant, your unconscious motive, your buried pain, your hidden longing, your twisted truth, has played a role everywhere. And at once you recognize patterns you never comprehended before. Why certain people drew you, certain conflicts repeated, why you never felt fully present even in apparently perfect moments. You see, life hasn't betrayed you. You betrayed yourself with the story you told about yourself. And the elephant, the massive, elusive truth in your core, was the blind spot you refused to see. Because you refused, you could never fully understand yourself. But now it's here. You have seen it, and that changes the rules. Suddenly you are no longer victim to your patterns, nor are you their puppet. You are the one who looks, who no longer flees, who's ready to grapple with what's raw and real. And that doesn't harden you, it sharpens you. Quieter, yet not voiceless. Less reactive, yet never indifferent. It brings a new form of responsibility. The responsibility to stop believing stories that shrink you. Of course, this is not easy. Whoever sees their elephant must learn to live with it. It doesn't vanish just because you acknowledge it. It wants to be heard, respected, integrated. That means relearning yourself, beyond ideals, roles, self-optimization. It means beginning to trust yourself even when you wobble. To cease correcting yourself merely to fit in. To allow yourself to be imperfect, but authentic. It's paradoxical. The moment you embrace your greatest imperfection, something consistent begins. Not because you're now better, but because you no longer try to be someone you never were. Because you start giving yourself space, and thus give space to others. For whoever sees their own elephant also recognizes it in others, and suddenly much becomes understandable, not excusable, but relatable. You see masks not as malice, but as fear. Arrogance often as shame's camouflage. Withdrawal as protection rather than dismissal. And that changes how you meet people, not naively, but with greater clarity, more patience, deeper presence. Seeing the elephant doesn't mean healing everything, nor does it guarantee you never relapse into old patterns. But you do it consciously. You notice sooner, realign more quickly, need fewer excuses, fewer distractions, fewer battles with reality. And that alone changes more than all your previous efforts. You begin to shape your life not by what sells well, but by what resonates. You choose differently. People, spaces, words, paths. You decide not from lack, but from connection. And you feel integrity is not theoretical, but tangible. In the way you move, in the silence after a conversation, in the glance you give yourself in the mirror. The journey is not a sprint, but a continuous practice, a constant remembering, pausing. You will be challenged. You will have moments wishing you'd never seen your elephant, when truth feels heavier than any lie, when you doubt whether it would have been easier to stay ignorant. But deep down you know, that time is gone. You cannot go back to unawareness, and you wouldn't want to. For all its complexity, it is truer now, more honest, and that matters more than any illusion ever could. Whoever sees the elephant begins to truly live, not perfectly, not definitively, but in a depth previously unreachable. And that changes not only you, it changes everything. Chapter 20. And now, What will you do with this? You've come this far. You didn't skip ahead, didn't switch off, didn't look away. You listened chapter by chapter, felt it, absorbed it, perhaps even swallowed it. And if you're honest, you know something in you has shifted. Maybe quietly, maybe profoundly, perhaps painfully clear. You've begun to see what you once only sensed. You've recognized what you long repressed, rationalized, or dismissed with a smile. The elephant is no longer a foreign creature. It's become your mirror, your reminder, your witness. And now you stand here, not at an end, but at a damn critical beginning. For the knowledge you now carry comes with responsibility. Not to me, not to this book or the voice you hear, but to yourself. You can't pretend not to know anymore. You can't revert to acting as though what you do has nothing to do with what you fear, what you seek to prove, or what you strive to avoid. The veils have fallen, and even if you pull them back up, they'll never quite sit the same. You'll sense the difference. Now is the moment to decide whether you have the courage to live this knowledge. Not in a radical, flamboyant, dramatic way, but at your own pace, in your own truth, step by step. It's not about upending your life tomorrow, questioning every relationship, bearing your soul. It's about becoming more conscious, more consistent, more authentic, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs you a role, a reputation, an illusion of safety. You have recognized yourself. You have seen your masks, exposed your games, unmasked your avoidance. Now it's time not to know more, but to act, to choose. Not always the easy path, but the true one. Not always the swiftest, but the most fitting. Maybe you will have conversations you have avoided for years. Maybe you will cease justifying yourself. Maybe you'll tell someone you no longer want to lie, to them or to yourself, even if it means losing them. Maybe you'll begin trusting your inner voice, even when it swims against the current. Maybe you'll listen differently, speak less, feel more. And perhaps for the first time, you'll know what it is to be faithful to yourself. It all sounds like freedom, and it is, but a freedom with shadows. For it means you can no longer blame anyone else. You can no longer lean on external excuses when inside you already know what you do and what you don't. This freedom demands you. It doesn't ask if it's comfortable. It asks only if it's true and whether you're willing to bear the outcome. Many will hear these words and do nothing. Not from superficiality, but because change costs. It costs the stories you settled into, the old roles that once felt safe, the connections that worked only so long as you didn't look too closely. And it costs above all one thing, the illusion that another time will do, that the moment to act is later. You can carry on as before, comforted by clever ideas, by spirituality, mindfulness, positive psychology, all neatly packaged, all seemingly profound, yet shallow if they don't land in real life. Or you can start today, not perfectly, not prepared, but honestly. Perhaps the first step is small. Stop saying what you don't feel. Stop playing roles you've grown weary of. Admit to yourself what you've denied for months, and stay with yourself, even when you tremble, even when it's awkward, even when you have no roadmap. For this is the core of the journey. Not knowing everything, not planning everything, but having the courage to be real. And their life begins, not the functional, structured, controlled life, but the felt life. What gets you out of bed without a mask? What keeps you alive in conversation without calculation? What lets you meet yourself in the mirror without turning away? It won't always be easy. There will be setbacks, doubts, old patterns creeping back. But you'll spot them sooner, and you won't fall as far because you can catch yourself. Not because you're perfect, but because you're honest. And that is the most enduring form of strength there is. At journey's end, there is no happy ending, no applause, no finish line. Only a beginning that is more authentic than anything you've known. And that beginning is yours. You have the choice. Not tomorrow, not when conditions improve, but now. For you now know what stirs in you. You know your elephant. Now it's up to you what you make of it. Thank you for listening to the end. If this content moved you, unsettled you, or made something in you visible that you long avoided, then it has done its work. Leave a comment. What touched you? What gave you pause? What will you do now with all this? And if you want more content, clear, honest, and deep, subscribe to the channel. Stay awake.